All right, let's take a look now at Chapter 4 Overview. So a few slides to discuss the chapter and get us familiar with what we're doing in this chapter. All right, Cascading Style Sheet Basics is the title of this chapter, and we're going to be taking a look at a few items. One, of course, the purpose of CSS, or Cascading Style Sheets, the advantages, right, of using CSS in lieu of, right, inline styling. How we go about configuring color. So we're going to introduce you to CSS by teaching you how to code color first. Okay, there's going to be a lot more stuff we're going to be doing with CSS, but the easiest way to understand CSS is to code color. And then we get comfortable with how we actually code color. So this will be the first thing we try to touch upon when working with CSS. All right, there are a few different ways we can actually style our pages, right, our content. One is called an inline style, the second is called embedded style, and a third is called external styles. There's one other style format, but we won't really touch upon that in this class. Okay, that's something just a little bit more advanced than this class. But we will look at all three of these, or you will look at all three of these within the book. Okay? And then we also take a look at extending, right, what our elements are to style with something called classes, IDs, and descendant selectors. So we're going to extend the features and functionality of our CSS with some of these types of, right, selectors. Class, ID, and descendants, or descendant. And then, of course, our new validator, right? It's in addition to our HTML validator. Okay. Ooh, oh. There we go. That's better, I think. Yes. All right. So, advantages of CSS. Probably the best advantage is that we can manage all of our stylings for all of our pages, if we want, in one file. See, before, everything needed to be styled right on every single page. Actually, right there in the element itself. So if you wanted to code a paragraph and make it red, you had to go to the file, open it, of course, find the P tag that you wanted to style, and code the styling right inside the opening P tag. That's called inline styling. But hold on a second. I have 5 paragraphs on this page. How do I style all 5? Oh, I guess I got to go to the second paragraph and do the same thing. And then I go to the third paragraph and do the same thing. I have to code them individually. That's inline styling. We don't like that anymore. We want to progress. And we did. We progressed to something called embedded. And then we progressed from that into something called external. Okay? So external is really where we want to go. And embedded is still being used, right? It's not that it's a bad thing, but using external is much more effective, much more efficient. Embedded is still being used from time to time and in special occasions. But, so our advantages are, we have greater control, right, of styling. Instead of having to go directly to the element, we can go to one file and change the stylings for multiple pages. Just think about it. We have one file, right, that essentially rules all of the other pages and how they're styled. If you got a three-page website, okay, not too bad. You can do them individually. But imagine having a 5, 10, 15, 20, 50-page website. There's no way I'm going to go to each individual page. I'm going to go to one file, make a change, which then cascades throughout the rest of the pages. All right? So I like to think that the cascading style sheet is like the Lord of the Rings, right? You got the 4 rings and the 1 to rule them all, right? That's the cascading style sheet, okay? So think of that when you think of cascading style sheets. Greater control, we separate style from structure. So now we separate the stylings, right, the way we want to make something look, right, with the actual structure of the page. We separate that. And so now the page is much, much cleaner. This gives us an advantage, both in search engine optimization and in accessibility, right? Making that page nice and streamlined. Okay. Well, theoretically, the file could be smaller because there's not a lot of code anymore, right? Because everything's now in a separate file. So really the page potentially, theoretically, could be a little smaller, which then would load maybe a little faster. Okay? And of course, the overarching is that it's easier to maintain. It's easier for me to maintain one file than it is to maintain, right, 2 or more files. Okay? Now, just one question, not to blow your mind or anything like that, but could we have more than one CSS file? Yeah, absolutely, right? Yeah, mostly in this class we'll be working with one. Okay. However, we are going to work with a second one. We're going to introduce you to how to actually use multiple CSS files. But for the most part, we'll be using one in this class. Okay, and then later on, closer to the end of the class, we'll show you how we can use 2. Okay, pretty cool. All right, questions? All right, let's roll. Or not. There we go. So here are those style sheets that we're talking about, or the different types of ways we can implement stylings. One is the inline style, which I told you about, which we don't like anymore, nobody uses anymore, but you got to know it just in case you run into a file that uses it, right? Then we have embedded styling, okay? The embedded styling essentially provides us a way to collapse all the stylings from the individual element all the way up into the top of the page, right? So we grab them all, we put them at the top of the page, but here's the issue. You're still working page to page, right? So embedded is better than inline, right? But it's not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal really is to use external style sheets, where we take the styling from the pages and move them to one file, okay? And then we have this imported styles, which is something similar to external. We don't really cover it in this class. It's outside the scope, okay? And more in a higher level class, like a JavaScript class or something, you would typically use imported styles. So we'll be really focusing on external styles. Okay, we'll talk about this, we'll give you an example of this, and then we'll actually work on this one most of the time. All right, here's just a kind of a little summary of the different styles. I've already talked about inline, that they're actually within the element themselves. So if you want to style the p tag, you have to go to the opening p tag and stick in some styling code, right? Some attribute to style. We don't like this anymore, okay? Embedded. We take out the styling from the element and we stick it inside the head element up at the top of the page, and we collect them all there. So they're all nice and grouped, okay? That's an embedded style sheet, but it's still within the page. And the third option, right, is that we have a separate file and our HTML simply links or points to that CSS file. This is the best way to do it. Okay? And then, of course, we have the imported, which is similar to styles, external styles. All right, so what does the CSS syntax look like? So the CSS rule is what they're typically called, is made up of 2 parts. The first part is what's called the selector, and the second part is made up of what's called the declaration. Okay? The first part, okay, can be an HTML element. So any HTML element that already exists is considered a HTML selector. Body, paragraph, UL, LI, DT, DD, DL, right? Any of the elements we have can be styled, okay? And you determine which of the elements you want by putting the element name, right? Good. Now, within curly braces or French braces, however you want to call them, we now have the declaration. The declaration is 2-part. The first part is the property of that declaration. It essentially indicates what part of the selector do you want to style. And the second part, separated by a colon, indicates how you want to style it. In this case, the word blue. So really what we're doing right now is we are taking the body, we're changing the color of the text to blue. And that's how we can read it. The body color is blue in this particular example. Okay. Now, this is only for an example, and we're using the word blue because it's easier to connect initially before we start working with hexadecimal values, right? Those are our colors. So we typically don't use name values for our colors, although you can. We typically use hexadecimal values. Okay? Those are those three groupings, right? The RGB, right? The two characters, and two characters that make up the color for us. Okay? All right. So here's an example. This example shows us an embedded, right, option. So we're going to take and style our page using an embedded style. Now, you'll notice that the code down at the bottom is missing something. It's just a typo. It appears that there should be a closing wicket, right, the greater than symbol at the end of the opening style. So just be aware that that this is not supposed to be that way. It is simply a typo. Okay? All right, so our embedded style is placed inside the head element, right? That thing all the way at the top. Remember, we have HTML, then we have head, then we have body. So inside the head element, along with the title, the meta element, goes a style element. And we take our rule, right, which is made up of an HTML selector and a property and its value, and we put it inside these curly braces. Okay? So in this case, we're changing the body element to a background color of black and a text color of white. The two ends of the spectrum for our hexadecimal, right, code. 000 is black, FFF is white, everything in between is the rainbow. Now, what's interesting is that there are two properties, right? Two declarations within this rule. How do we separate declarations? Huh? Yeah, so we separate each of the properties within a declaration with a semicolon. So if I want more than one, I just add a semicolon at the end. But I don't have a third one, but this one, right, the color property, has a semicolon after it. Why? Thank you. In case you want to add one later, right? It's easier to add simply the property than to try to remember to add the semicolon. So in your mind, consider each property and value pair, the semicolon should go after it, right? Even if you don't have another one, because you really want to start typing here, and we always forget to put one in. So if you just make the assumption, right, make the rule in your own head that every time we write one of these, stick a semicolon at the end, you'll be much happier. Okay? It's just easier that way. Good coding practice. All right, so far so good? All right, let's rock and roll. So here is an example, okay, of another embedded style sheet, but with a few more, right, selectors added. So what's happening is that we're styling the body with a background color and a text color, right? So background dash color is the background color of body. Color is the text color. So color always equals the color of the text. And so we're styling them, and you'll notice that it's got like this purple background in the graphic, and then the text color you can see here, it's kind of like this is a light purple, and this is a little bit darker purple text. Okay. But what you'll notice is that the H1 at the top is different, and the H2 is different than the body. Even though the body has identified, the rule says, make it this color and the text color, right? So why is H1 and H2 different than the rest? Well, it's because we've applied separate rules for them. So the H1 should have a background color of whatever color this is, some sort of purple. And then the text color is going to have this color, again, another variation of purple. So if we take a look at our sample, the first line is the H1. You'll see that the background color is darker than the text color. And so that's what the H1 does here. Make sense? And that's what we're doing for H2. So essentially, it's overriding, right, the body. It's overriding it, saying that, hey, I don't want everything to be this background and this color text. I want the H1 to look a little different, and then I want the H2 to look a little different. Okay? So whatever element you want to change, you simply have to code it, right? You have to use the selector for it. Okay. So far, so good? All right. Now, where do we put all of these rules, right? If we're going to move on to something that's not embedded, right? We have inline, old, we don't use anymore. Embedded, still being used, but but it's still maintenance heavy, right? Because we have to go to each file to do it. And what we really want to achieve is an external environment, right? External style sheet. So we have to create a file called .css. So that is an external style sheet. Okay? It will not have any other extension other than .css. Right? Cascading style sheet. That's what .css stands for. Now, in that file, the only thing you'll be writing are the rules. No HTML. So you don't include the style element. You only include, right, the rule, the selector, and the declaration. Those are the only two things you include. And you can include as many rules as you want. Yeah. Well, technically, it does. For a couple of reasons. One, the browser will look at the CSS file and render it in the browser in the order in which they appear. Right? Okay. Second, if you have a lower rule, it may override the one above it. Right? So there is, so technically there is, right? And what we're doing in this class for the most part, we don't get too complex until we get to the responsive design, right? But I'm going to ask you to order your styles in the order in which they appear in your HTML, right? Absolutely, right? So for those two reasons, well, and maybe a third is that you can read them easier, right? So now you know where if I have to look for something in the footer that's going wrong, I know that I should be looking at the bottom of the CSS and not someplace in the middle, right? So it's a lot easier to maintain. Any other questions? That was a great question. There we go. So how does this external CSS look, right? How do we actually develop it? Well, one, the rule is going to be identical. So there's really no change to the syntax of the rule, only that it appears in the CSS file. So we take the rule out of the embedded, right, style sheet, and we stick it in a separate file all by itself. Okay. Now, how does our HTML file know that there's a CSS file that it has to use for styling it? Well, we use something called link. Okay. A new element for us. Okay. Not for HTML, but for you. What I mean, us, the class. We haven't seen this one yet. Okay. This can be used in a couple different ways, and we'll see it throughout the course. In this case, we're using it for a style sheet, right? And it's got an href, which we're all familiar with now because of the anchor, right? Uses an href, which essentially points us to where that CSS file lives. So the HTML file gets loaded in the browser. One of the first things that happens, right, because it loads it in the order it appears, it goes and looks for a file called colors.css in the same folder that this file is in, whatever, or the HTML file is in. So whatever folder that file is in, because it doesn't have a path to it, it assumes that, let's say it's the index file, it assumes that the CSS file is in the same folder, because there is no path here, okay, to a different folder. So it looks for a CSS file, it looks at all the styles, and then starts to apply them top to bottom. Make sense? Cool. All right. We'll do this tonight. All right. Now, in addition to our HTML selectors, right, all those HTML elements that we can style based on their name, we can create three others: class, an ID, and a descendant. Okay. So what we're doing is we're extending our options with these three additional selector types. Okay? We give us a little bit more power to organize and manage styles that we'd like to create. okay, or rules that we want to create. So the first one is called a class, and it's denoted by a period before the name of the class that you get to create. It is not a name that is already being used. So you can't use a period body or a period P or a period UL. Okay? You don't use elements that are already in existence, right, as a class. The purpose of the class is to make up a name that you would use. Typically, how it's being used, not how it's styling. So you don't want to call a style red 15 times Roman, because at some point in time, you're going to change the style, and it will no longer be red, and it will no longer be times Roman. It'll be something else, right? And so you don't want the name to now confuse anyone. So you name it for its purpose. Okay. So we use a period and then the class name. So the purpose of the class is to allow for reusing of names. So if I'd like to style, right, something that appears multiple times on my page, like a paragraph, I use a class to do that. Right? So I create a class, I design my style the way that I want, maybe blue text, it's bold, it's at 15 pixels, and it's right aligned. And I want to apply that to 4 out of the 5 paragraphs on my page. Because I'm reusing that style, I need to use a class. It's basically a way to organize styles, right? It's a management function. All right, the next option is we have an ID. Okay, again, a custom selector. We create, we decide the name, but this one is identified by a pound sign in front of the name. The rule behind this one is that you can't reuse this one. It can only be used once on a page. You can reuse it throughout your website, but only once on a page. You're probably like, well, that's not very useful. It is, because it allows us to categorize our styles, those that are being reused and those that are not, right? What type of element may not be reused on a page? So how many footers do you think you're going to have on your page? How many footer elements do you think you'll have on a page? Probably one. How many headers do you think you might have on a page? One. The actual header element itself. Probably one. How many mains do you think you might have on your page? One, right? So these elements, right, that you will be using one time, you use an ID for. In fact, if you try to use an ID more than once on the page, the same one, your validator is going to, right, kick off an error. So essentially it's telling you, no, you've designated this as a rule that should only be used once. I'm helping you manage that. Okay? So that's the idea. All right, and now descendant selectors. Think of descendant, right, as related or a part of. So this particular example essentially is trying to style something within another element. Right? So applying a CSS rule within the context of the container or parent element. Okay, we have a footer, okay, that has a style. That means the footer is going to be styled like this, the whole thing. So whatever's inside of it is going to get styled with that text color. But I don't want that. I only want the paragraph element that's within the footer to be styled. This is a descendant selector. So it's going to look for a P tag, which must be in the footer to be styled. If it's not, it doesn't get styled. This provides us even more power, right? To really define and be selective to those elements we want to style. Make sense? All right. CSS and styling is not something that comes quickly, right? It takes practice, just like the HTML did, and does as we move forward. So one of the biggest tips that I can give you is just have some patience. Okay? Don't try to rush through it, because there's a lot of little things that we can, right, make a mistake on. Curly braces, semicolon, colons. We forget the pound sign. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. So taking your time, right, is essential. And of course, using the validator. We like that. All right, any questions? Fantastic. Now, we have another element which I think we brought up before or was used in the case study, but maybe wasn't exactly defined. I thought we had talked about it, but we're going to repeat it if we did, and we're going to talk about it for the first time if we have not. The div element. Okay, I think I indicated it as a kind of wild card element for us, where we can really use it for anything we want. We just kind of stuff anything we want inside of it, okay? And we can style it any way we want, okay? But the important thing about the div is that it's a block level element. It displays in a block, which means it gives you a line break above and after the element itself. So if you want something to appear right next to it, well, right off the bat, you may not want to use the div, because by default, it'll appear below it. Okay. Now, with CSS, there are ways to take that block and make it in line. Okay. We'll learn that later on. However, the important thing to know about the div, that its default styling, the way it works, is that it is block, which means it will appear below the element above it. Okay. Great. And again, it's just a generic, right, catch-all that we can use for a lot of things. If the content that you want to put on your page doesn't have a home, which means it's not a paragraph, it's not a bullet list, it's not an image, it's not any of these things that we have elements for, then stick it in the div, right? And, or, right, put all those things inside of it. Put the image in there, put the paragraph in there, right? It's a catch-all. Okay, we can use it for really anything we'd like. But the important thing is that it's a block display, right? It displays as a block. Line breaks above and after. Now, let's say we don't want to have the element display below the previous one. We want to display it right next to it, right? Or within another element. Here we use the span element. The word itself indicates that it spans across, right? It doesn't break or create a division area, right? So we use the span to style elements, right, in line or within, right, other elements. In this example, we created a class, right? So we might be reusing this one on the page multiple times. This way, we change the font weight to bold, we change the font family to Georgia, Times New Roman, and if they don't have either of these, then it uses any other serif font, right? And then the font size, right? So these are the properties we decided to change for this example. And we only wanted to change just the company name. We did not want to change the whole paragraph. So inside the paragraph, we use the span element that designates the class we created to style just the company name. That's how we use span. Okay. If we were to use div, what would happen? Yeah, you'd get right down below. Well, that's not right. That doesn't even make sense. And we're putting a div inside of a paragraph. That doesn't make sense either. Okay? Yeah. You put the paragraph inside the div. Okay. Sound good? All right. So the basic thing is you're not going to get a line break when you use span. That's the takeaway. All right. And then, of course, our last thing, and one of the more important things that we like, right, as developers, is some way to check our work. So the W3C does that for us by providing us with a validator for CSS. We'll use it tonight. Okay. Yeah, we covered a lot of stuff. CSS, the rules, the syntax, the different types, inline, embedded, external, right? And then additional selectors to the HTML ones, class, ID, even descendant, which is not listed in the bullet here. And then, of course, our validator. Any questions? Yeah, Michael. Okay. That's a great question. Your file in this class will need at least one CSS file. However, you can have multiple CSS files if you want. And one page could actually be requesting more than one. Okay? But we'll typically focus on using one in this class, except for I think in one of the chapters where we show you how to use two. Great question. Any other? Yes. Yes. Yes, so HTML5 says you don't need any attributes within the style element. It's just style, and that's it. Yeah. A lot less to type, which is really nice. Yeah. And that's true for a few other things as well, which is nice. We don't need all that extra attribute stuff. Any other questions? Okay. Fantastic.